Dobrodošli u Page Not Found, a ipak ste nas našli. Ovo je još jedan limitirani serijal podcasta organizacije KOD koji će se baviti open data temom, odnosno otvorenim podacima, njihovom dostupnošću za javnost, kako nam transparentnost institucija pomaže u boljem upravljanju Crnom Gorom. Ja sam Nina Pantović, dobrodošli. Naš današnji gost je Jean-Noé Landry. On dolazi iz Kanade i pričat će nam o svom iskustvu u temi open data. Jean-Noé, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being our guest. And I would like to start this interview by your introduction. You could say a few words about yourself and how did you end up in the open data initiatives and generally in this topic.
So thank you very much for having me. I've received a very warm and kind of hospitable kind of approach when I've been back in the Balkans. My name is Jean-Noé, and I consider myself an open data activist. I'm also somebody who works on specific issues around climate change as well as what I call systemic mediation. But the way that I got started with open data is actually after having worked in a number of different countries around the world. So I was working in Croatia and Serbia almost like 20 years ago. Worked in different places.
In which area, sorry? Like the democracy?
Democracy, yeah. So it was, helping build the institutions and working alongside like democracy activists. So in places like Russia and West Bank, in Tunisia. And it's when I was living in Kenya when these civic tech activists were talking about how can we trace the discretionary funding of members of parliament and whether or not how those public funds are actually being distributed equally and fairly to everybody in their constituencies, or whether or not those funding is only going towards their tribal affiliation. And they were talking about we need to open up that data. We need to open up those databases to be able to understand that. And so that really kind of struck me, and I was like, open data, what does that mean? Like data. And once you start kind of like thinking about data, you kind of see this kind of invisible world like around you, and it's everywhere, So much of what we do is governed and impacted by data. So it also kind of struck me that, well, it's not just in Kenya and just like in many places in the world where there's corruption and collusion. And it made me kind of focus on my own country, and kind of with humility to kind of go back to Canada and say, okay, where's the community that's opening up data in order to fight corruption and collusion in Montreal, the city where I lived? So I got involved and I met a few people, and we started an open data initiative called Open Montreal, and then we also created Open Quebec. But Open Montreal really had a focus on getting the city to adopt the first open data policy.
Yeah, what would that mean for the citizens?
Well, that's the key thing, because when we talk about open data, to most people, actually the majority of people, they're like, what is that, right? Like, who cares about that? So the key thing about open data is to connect it to real problems, real challenges that people have on a daily basis, or different types of like systemic kind of like issues that exist in society. So in the Montreal context, I'll give you like a very kind of specific example that's very Montreal. Okay, so in Montreal we have ice rinks because it snows, we have long winters, and we love to play outside in the winter. And we have like maybe 200 different public ice rinks. But if you're with your friends and you're like, where could I go and get the best ice conditions, to go play hockey outside? Well, the city takes care of like, the ice, and it releases a report on the ice conditions, but it's in a PDF format. And it's somewhere on the website. And so we scraped that data, and then we created an application that enables us to get notification when the city actually, has treated or worked on your ice rink that's closest to you. So that's like
it's like recycling, yeah?
In a way.
Using it for another purpose. Using data for another purpose.
Yeah, so that's like a nice example that's kind of a little bit harmless, and it's more about community building and like community welfare, you know. But then you also get into, you know, some of the harder kind of like issues where you need to kind of actually have access to, you know, data that is not necessarily more sensitive, because if we talk about data, open data, we're not talking about personal information, and we're not talking about information that compromises like national security. So these are like two of the big categories. So put that aside, then you're left with a whole lot of data that should be available by default in a comprehensible, machine readable, and available and standardized way. So that's the open data principle. So it's not up to me, Jean-Noé, to define what open data is. We have an international definition of what that is so that everybody understands it. But the key thing is to connect it to the actual needs that people have. Yeah.
To really use it. On top of your mind, what do you see as positive sides of this? And are there negative sides? Because listening to you now, when separating the personal information and government classified information, now we're left with different various information. So are there even negatives to this information for misuse and false news or something like that?
Well, there could be. And so like 10 years ago when I started kind of getting involved in open data, there wasn't the same kind of like fake news and disinformation like context, you know? So we weren't necessarily thinking about that. Cambridge Analytica hadn't happened necessarily, you know? So we were still in this kind of like, technology and like more data, civic tech, like data for good, technology for good. So there's like a very kind of like optimistic kind of like worldview. Now I think people are a little bit more sober or a little bit more kind of skeptical, right?
Yeah.
And so to your point, I think, you know, sometimes, and you hear this from government, you know, employees, and they're like, I'm getting this request for this data, and then I release it because it's public information and I respect it, and I want to do my job and I want to do the right thing. So I give them access, and then they interpret it in a way that's completely different, you know? But so my answer to that is just like good journalists, you know, if you put out a bad story, then somebody is going to correct it, because ultimately it's about your own credibility, you know, in interpreting that data itself. So there's a self-correction kind of like process that happens when people start interpreting data. And if it's poorly interpreted, then it's up to all of us to kind of call it out, you know? So open data is really fundamentally about reinvigorating or kind of energizing a different type of like scrutiny and dialogue in civil society, and really kind of having much more fact-based kind of like discussions around the world around us.
Yeah. Now something that will probably get you to open up more. There was a case in one of the Scandinavian countries where they decided to make public and accessible data about citizens' tax numbers. So how much tax did they pay?
Yeah.
After that, what happened? They were targeted by some criminals, with various in various ways, and they were they suffered consequences. They were robbed or whatever, because they could calculate how much wealth they have and how to target them easier. And that's what I want to ask: where do we draw a line between a person's human rights and privacy and safety and public interest?
Yeah, so it's an important conversation, and I think the point there is that we know that governments make those kinds of risk assessments, you know, before they release that data, but they don't necessarily release the risk assessment as a basis for a conversation about the impact, you know, of how that data could be used or misused. So part of like the open data kind of discourse and approach is to situate it within the open government kind of mindset, you know, to have that conversation with people so that people kind of like understand it. But to your point, you know, I think there's a lot of ways that data could be anonymized, for example. So maybe I'm not totally aware of that specific use case, you know, but I think we're also learning that, yeah, data can be misused and actually be quite harmful and reinforce like systemic racism racism and discrimination and marginalized like communities and whatnot. So I think part of it is to engage the people who could be impacted by that data, and then coming up with ways to mitigate those risks. So you need to kind of open up the way that government makes those decisions around data management and data release, and actually take into account the value chain and the way that that data will be used or misused as well. It's about trust building, essentially. Yeah.
So it's all still not experimenting, but trying to make things better.
Fundamentally, yes. And I think that's partly what motivates people to be engaged in open data. Otherwise, we just have a bunch of data that's sitting in like a server somewhere. And so what we've seen over the years is really kind of a transformation around the data conversation, where people that collect a lot of data, they don't necessarily see themselves anymore as owners of that data, but they see themselves as like custodians of that data. And once you start kind of changing that mindset, then you realize that you're sitting on a lot of like potential, for innovation, for reuse of data, to have maybe intersectional kind of like analysis, to have much more holistic understanding of society, like disaggregated gender data, for example. If you connect that with like, health outcomes analysis, we need to have better policies, better programs. So we need to kind of break these information silos across the public administration, and then bring in the perspective of people who are impacted by those services to contribute in the design of those services using real life data. And oftentimes we realize like, oh, maybe we should be collecting data differently, because data is power and data is about, choices. No data is, objective. Even scientific like methods, there's still a human being behind that machine, coding and making decisions. And so that human being will never be, God. So we need to kind of, just kind of assume our humanity, and kind of recognize that, we have these biases, and these biases actually, have real life consequences.
Well, what I am hearing and seeing is data in that sense means knowledge, and knowledge brings prosperity and better governing, better quality of life. Yeah. How do you experience, how do you see how data is being used in Montenegro? And what is your experience? Because you told me in preparation for this interview, what you experienced with one institution in Montenegro. But I want you to tell me, are there any flaws, to call them like that, that you see in the system?
Right. So I'm not here to like judge, Montenegro, because each country has their own way, to kind of embark on the open data journey. And we need to look at their respective capabilities, the governance of the data, how, it's been used and whatnot. So there's rankings, that do that kind of work. But in the Montenegro context, and the conversations that I've been having, what's clear is that there is already a lot of data that is being used to develop, reporting and analysis. And when you think about data, it's useful to think about data in terms of a life cycle. Just like human beings, we grew up and we have like different stages in our lives. Well, the data goes from like collection to, processing to analysis, storage and whatnot. But we often only see the outputs of that analysis and don't necessarily see the raw data. So in many different government agencies, what you see is these big reports, like you have, the finance kind of like, agency, all these quarterly reports, but we don't necessarily have the way to communicate what the data is saying for different kind of users, right? So it's like a massive report that's not necessarily accessible. So this is where we start talking about data literacy. So there's a gap in how we're able to facilitate a broader understanding and a deeper understanding of how that data actually means something to everyday citizen. So that's like financial data. Like, I'm not an accountant. If I read that big kind of like statistics and like all those numbers, I'm like, okay, that's a little bit intimidating, actually. Another example would be maybe in the like anti-corruption, kind of agency. They also have like a lot of analysis. But again, it's like, this is kind of like the information that's there. There could be maybe kind of the raw data that accompanies that. So that maybe, maybe people who also care about anti-corruption, and there's a lot of people, in Montenegro, a lot of CSOs, that also care about this, that could maybe have a different kind of analysis, because their experience and the experience of the people that they're engaged with at the grassroots level and through their networks, maybe they can add a different perspective and different value by interpreting that data as well. But for that, you need to also have, CSOs that may need to have, maybe boost their kind of like digital kind of capacity as well, right? So that it's not just the private sector, that's able to have those types of competencies, because they have highly advanced ways of like working with data. So we need to kind of even the playing field of how we're able to interpret that data across society.
What I have been experiencing from my being and working in Organization KOD is how we process the data that we got from the government, and like we are working on a topic of how much water does one city's water network lose, sewage network, and then in 1 year after that we just click and we needed that data again in a different topic. And that's what just clicked for me, how it was very useful for us, for our growing, to have the data, to them being easily accessible, which is rarely the case, maybe in the last year, but before we really needed to dig and try and, I want to say beg, we didn't, but it was like waiting for them to have mercy and give us information.
Right.
And it was, in most situations, it was either scanned, that the text isn't copyable, you can't copy it. Stamps, or it's just scanned 2 times. Like you are scanning a copied version, or if you get like a table with numbers, it's just like it's not organized. It's then it's manipulatable. You can present it, you can edit it, and you can present it like you had that from the government.
Yes.
So what I wanted to ask you is, how does a crew that's working with data have to be technologically literate, or how fast can somebody that's, I don't want to presume, but I'm using my mother for an example. She's 60, she's near her pension, but she has to adapt to this. She has to work with this data. Do you have experiences how this was applicable in an institution with these kind of parameters?
Yes, I would never assume or even try to teach coding to my mom, for example. I think that's, with all due respect to my mom, and I don't think that she would need to. I think what really matters is, is the user interface of how that data is accessible to her actually, communicated in a way that she's able to understand it, right? And so we need to spend more time when we're developing these digital services and these types of digital services, to really have a really good process around product development, as well as defining those personas, and we can characterize them with different levels of knowledge and skills in the way that they're able to do that. And that's part of good kind of just product development design. And so in the context of Montenegro, when we talk about, the potential for a new open data portal, for example, we all know about the cyber attacks and things like that. So now there's, conversations around a new data portal. So that should be something that goes hand in hand, with an engagement process of a wide variety of people inside government and outside government. That's really, really important.
In Montenegro recently, we had a situation where institutions, the government decided that institutions of the government could internally decide what gets to be classified and what gets to be public without consulting with the government, or maybe a higher instance like an institution for their ministry. They don't have to correspondence this. They can just decide it's internal and classified. And that they will not share it with the public.
Right.
Even with the request for free access to information.
Okay. So, I'm not familiar with that specific case, but oftentimes, when you do these public consultations, you also need to be accountable to the people who provide input, and you need to set, clear rules so that you're able to trace back if somebody contributes to that public engagement process. Have they done something about it, You know, so when we talk about open data, it's not just, you know, ones and zeros, you know, coding. It's also about qualitative data. It's about text analysis. It's about like that, exactly what you're talking about, the qualitative data as well. So it's important to be able to trace back, you know, the decisions that were made, you know, based on the input of citizens. So citizen engagement, you know, is a fundamental part of the open government like approach around transparency and accountability. But, you know, like just thinking about my mother, for example, but also thinking about just real life example, you know, just to kind of go into some specifics as we're talking right now. So over the weekend, I went and I saw a beautiful kotor and all that. You know, I was like on the coast and like I was, you know, with some friends. And there were a couple of moments like in hindsight where I was like, oh, actually, that's like an open data kind of like opportunity, you know. And one was I was there and then I saw these massive cruise ships, you know, coming in. It's big, like big things. I don't know even how to call it, kind of grotesque, but you know, skyscraper on the side, you know, you know, kind of coming in. And I know from the Canadian experience that we have those on the West Coast, you know, in British Columbia, and they pollute a lot, you know, it's like a lot of waste and it's very difficult to regulate, you know, these big, massive boats. And so I looked at the water and it looked really, really nice, you know, but I was like, I could also see that. And so the question that I had in my mind is like, is that water okay? Is it safe for me to kind of jump in the water, or am I going to get some bacteria that I don't even want to see under a microscope because it looks really scary, you know? And so that's an open data kind of like, you know, issue. Because if somebody is, you know, collecting water samples and has the scientific kind of like data that could be available in machine readable format, that could be integrated into some application that would be geolocated with my, you know, mobile phone, where I could ask, okay, is the water safe where I am? And then you'd get like updated information. It's like, yes, it's safe. Dive in, you know? So there's like all these little things, like everyday kind of like decisions that we make. And then again, in Kotor, you know, I was looking at the over-tourism in a way, right? Yeah. Just like, oh, it's like a parking lot full of like people that are just crammed. And then you're like, okay, like, is there a way that we can maybe, you know, share data around like the influx of like tourists, you know, for maybe these travel agencies, you know, so that they know how we could maybe they know when these tourists are coming in, and maybe there could be a redistribution, you know, of tourists so that we diversify the sites so they don't all go to the same church and the same thing, because there could be like other things that we could see, you know, in the area. At the same time, we also need open data to be able to protect the natural kind of like environment around Kotor so that it doesn't get disintegrated, you know, because of so many tourists that are kind of walking around. So all those different issues relate to data that could be combined into that type of like analysis as well. So it's really concrete things. You know, you go from like very abstract kind of philosophical principles. It sounds like a nice thing. Maybe, okay, I think I understand. But at the end of the day, it's really how you translate it into your everyday, you know, issues that you face.
You were talking about that for the open data, for an open data successful story, you need citizens' engagement. And it often starts with the citizens' initiative. How would you, or why, do you recommend it to Montenegrin citizens? And how would you motivate them or like give them a little insight on how it can make their life better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's reflecting on, like I said, you know, it's like these kind of day-to-day challenges that you have and the things that you want to know about your government. There's probably a lot of questions that people have, you know, where's, you know, and I know I've had this conversation before. It's like maybe even the notion of like taxpayers' money, you know, it's like my right to kind of know where that public funding is going. But being able to trace like, you know, finances, you know, and where the money and follow where the money goes, and even contracting data. Why is one company favored against another? Why is it always the same company that gets that contract? And then when they do the work, it's in poor condition, and then we have to get another contract, and it's the same company that fixes the problem that it created itself, you know? So it's really, you know, it really kind of like opens your mind to possibilities of actually improving your living conditions, as well as connecting people, I think, more closely. It's not the solution to everything, because you still need to talk to each other. And it's also an opportunity for citizens to, raise their level of awareness, knowledge, as well as situate citizens vis-a-vis, maybe even the private sector or CSOs and like scientists. So we all need to kind of, citizens are the ones that are really at the heart of democracy, right? And if for that to kind of occur, even when the political situation is very challenging, there's still an opportunity to kind of demonstrate that open data, could maybe do something that's meaningful and impactful. And we need to be able to document that and tell those stories, Otherwise, because I did meet some public servants that really believe in open data, and they really believe that it's their responsibility to make that data available, but there needs to be reciprocity. And we also need to empathize with those public servants so that we don't lose them, because there's some good people that are trying to do their work in a responsible way because they believe in it. They're overworked, they're tired, and I met them. But, there are some champions inside the Montenegrin government. And I know that maybe for some of the listeners, it's like, oh, God, this Canadian guy, he doesn't really know. But it's like that in many, many places in the world,
I feel like that is true, because it is very hard that we function if we don't have people existing like that already. So we do have them. And I wish for them to hold it and to stick to what they're doing by now.
Yes.
Jean-Noé, I want to apologize for mispronouncing your name in the beginning of the interview.
That's
and
okay.
To ask you if you maybe have something to say that I didn't maybe ask you, and that you find very that you wanna say in this interview.
I would say I think maybe to think less about kind of data and to not necessarily be intimidated by that conversation, because data is not necessarily the most accessible one, but it's also one that could be very, very motivating. Data can be empowering in a way. It's a powerful tool. It's an enabler to kind of change society and change systems, that are in place. So I think there's at the end of the day, I consider myself to be kind of a hopeful pragmatist, because I'm never going to stop from thinking that we can actually change the world, to make it better. And I've worked in some crazy places, I'm not saying Montenegro is crazy, but sometimes each country has its own definition of madness, And so we all think that we're different, but at the end of the day, we actually have a lot in common. And I've learned over the years, working in, a dozen more countries and being very active locally, is that at the end of the day, we want dignity, we want human rights, we want to be able to be respected, and data can be part of that solution.
Thank you so much for being our guest and being a part of this series. Hvala i vama što ste nas gledali. Ako želite da nastavite da gledate naš kratki podcast serijal, zapratite nas i budite tu u sljedećem videu. Pozdrav!